verses 1 to 23. So, what was going on last week? Last couple of weeks, actually.
Well, Jesus has been traveling around and kind of doing miracles and healing
Mm-hmm.
and kind of calling people on, their behavior.
He stopped and preached a sermon to his disciples, right? What do you remember from that sermon that he's been preaching?
Blessings and woes.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like the Beatitudes, sort of.
Yes.
But
Mm-hmm.
some other stuff.
What was the point of the blessings and woes? Do you remember?
Well, it's the opposite of everything we think is blessed and what the world will say is blessing.
That's right. So if you are a follower of Jesus, he's calling you to a life that just functions according to different conventions. It doesn't look the way the world expects. It looks very different. And Jesus, before he gets to any of the commands, I think he actually starts off by saying, essentially, what you're going to hear is hard, but there are blessings in store if you're willing to embrace the things that Jesus says and to follow his way of teaching. In fact, that is the only way to true blessing, is to obey, hear his word and obey. Okay, what else from that sermon? Don't make me teach it again.
Well, active non-resistance is something that you put in your notes.
In terms of what? What does that refer to?
Treat those who hurt you with kindness,
Mm-hmm.
and those, who want your coat or steal your coat, give them your pants and everything else, not just give.
But the context is important. What's the context? Does this mean that if you're walking down the street and somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, I want that shirt, give it to me," that you just strip down and hand them everything over? No, because there's a context. Say that again.
To your brethren?
To your enemies, actually. It's in the context of persecution.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah? So all those things that Jesus is talking about, he's talking about the way that you deal with people who are your enemies for his sake. When you encounter people who oppose you, who are your adversaries because you are a Christian, this is what Jesus is talking about. Now, there might be times when somebody is an enemy of you, and it's not specifically because of Jesus, but it still is because there's a problem there's a disparity in your character. There's something you're doing that they don't like because they're not believers. I think you could include those kinds of things in this sort of idea, but the bigger context is Jesus is saying he encounters opposition because of who he is. If you're going to be a disciple of his, you should expect that you're going to encounter opposition as well. So when that happens, how do you deal with it? You deal with it the way Jesus did. And how did Jesus deal with it? Was he a milksop? Did he just let everybody walk over him? No. And we haven't even gotten to some of the stuff where he is a very awkward dinner guest, can I just say? You think at some point the Pharisees would be like, no more inviting that guy. He speaks the truth. He confronts falsehood. He confronts injustice. He tells people what they need to hear. He tells them things they don't want to hear. He is very straightforward. He has no problem provoking things when he knows there's an issue that needs to be brought to the surface. But he doesn't retaliate against his enemies. He doesn't bully people, right? He doesn't have to get everybody to do exactly what he wants right now. I mean, he could, because he's got the power to do that. But he loves his enemies, and he forgives people, and he calls his followers to do the same. And that requires some discernment to really think out, how does Jesus treat his enemies, and what does he call me to do in relation to people who oppose me as well? Okay, anything else you want to mention from last week?
Well, we're a part of the family of God, and we're marked with a love that makes pagans scratch their heads.
We should be, that's right.
Yeah.
Because this is that kind of response to suffering, that kind of response to persecution, it's a God-ordained means of evangelism. It's intended to make Jesus known to people, particularly to people who might not otherwise give you the time of day. they might not listen to what you have to say, but you can demonstrate something about how Jesus has treated you by choosing to treat your enemies in a way that reflects the love of God. Yeah. Okay, anything else?
A tree is known by its fruit, so actions lead to people.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Hypocrisy is going to be exposed at some point. Anything else? Okay, so let's look at a section that comes next. So chapter 7, verses 1 to 23. When Jesus had finished saying all this in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. There a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, who has soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. "A prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. John's disciples told him about all these things. Calling 2 of them, he sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" When the men came to Jesus, they said, "John the Baptist sent us to you to ask, 'Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else?'" At that very time, Jesus cured many who had diseases, sicknesses, and evil spirits, and gave sight to many who were blind. So he replied to the messengers, "Go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me." Okay, so how does chapter 7 begin? In verses 1 to 5.
The centurion came and asked him to heal his servant.
Mm-hmm. And it's actually not the centurion who comes.
It's not. Centurion's servant. Oh, yeah.
So he's got messengers, and who are the messengers?
Elders of the Jews.
Huh, that's funny. Okay, so let's talk about this situation. So there's this centurion living there in Capernaum. There's this centurion living in Capernaum who has this servant he cares about, and his servant's very sick and about to die. Now, those details of verse 2 are important because I think it's giving us a hint already. This miracle is going to be less about the healing than it is about the centurion. Like it's the centurion who's actually the one who's got Jesus' attention through all of this. So a centurion was an officer in the Roman army who commanded a group of about 100 soldiers within a legion. So this man would have been a Gentile, and he would have been someone with authority and means, and the Roman soldiers were typically not well liked by the Jews because they had a tendency to extort money out of people and all that sort of thing. But this man, when he hears about Jesus, this centurion, he sends some elders of the Jews to Jesus to ask him to come and heal his servant. Why do you think he wouldn't just come himself?
Well, he says it later, he's not worthy. I mean, he respects Jesus, even if he may not know who he is, he respects him.
That's interesting. how the religious leaders have been treating Jesus. And now you see this centurion he's a Roman military officer. He's got authority.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he looks at Jesus and his assumption is, I couldn't possibly get access to that guy because of who I am. He doesn't even try. And yeah, there's a humility in this man that's very interesting. It's refreshing, I think, that you see this guy with position and power who, number one, loves his servant enough to seek help for him when lots of people didn't really care. And number two, that there's no arrogance or sense of entitlement with this guy. Why are the Jewish elders willing to help this Gentile army officer?
Well, probably for their own. If I'm not being nice to me.
Well, what do they say about him?
Oh, because of the temple, yeah, or
The synagogue,
Yeah.
because of how he treats them, how he treats the Jews in the community. So they plead with Jesus on his behalf because they say this centurion loves the Jews and has even built their local synagogue for them. It's interesting the way they put it. When they come to Jesus, they say the centurion deserves to have Jesus help, which is kind of astonishing when he's both a Gentile and a soldier. But that's the kind of impact his generosity has had on the Jewish community in Capernaum. Now, it's interesting that this whole scene follows that sermon that Jesus just preached in chapter 6. Because after all the things he just said about loving your enemies and doing good to them and not condemning and being merciful and forgiving, how would you expect him to respond to a centurion? Probably by practicing what he preaches, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Jesus goes with these men because the centurion deserves his help. I think Jesus goes with them because he's gracious and merciful, because he's willing to help even somebody that the community would typically see as an enemy, although this guy has managed to get himself on the right side of the Jews. He also knows that while the Jews are trying to explain why a man who looks like an enemy isn't really, there's actually something more significant going on with this centurion. I think that Jesus knows and the Jews haven't figured out yet. Now, what happens then in verses 6 to 8?
He wasn't far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Don't trouble yourself, because I'm not worthy to come to you. If you say the word, my servant will be healed."
So, even though the Jews consider him to be deserving of Jesus' help, it turns out that the centurion himself does not see it that way. In fact, he addresses Jesus as Lord right here. Again, that's astonishing for an army officer to address a Jewish rabbi that way. But in his message, he calls him Lord and then says, yeah, I don't even deserve to have you come in my house. So just do it from a distance. That display of humility is really surprising. But what's even more surprising is when he says, if you just say the word, my servant will be healed. Now, why does he say that? He explains here what his thinking is. What does he add to that comment right here?
Because that's what he does to the people under his authority.
That's right. He understands something profound about the authority of Jesus. And it's significant that we're talking about not just power, but authority. You can have power without having authority, because power is just the ability or the capacity to do something. But authority is power on a next level, because authority is the power to control and command and determine what other people do. And this centurion understands that difference because he himself is in the middle of a military power structure where he obeys authority and he exercises authority. So when you have authority, you can command people, and they do what you say. You direct your soldiers or your servants, and they follow your command. Now, how does that apply to Jesus? What does the centurion understand about Jesus to say that?
I think he's saying that Jesus has even more power and authority than what he does as a centurion.
And if the centurion thinks he can heal from a distance, who has that kind of authority?
God.
know if the centurion is really thinking Jesus is God, but he clearly recognizes that Jesus has divine authority to be able to do this healing from a distance, to just say the word. That's amazing. He sees beyond Jesus' power to heal, which is what everybody's seeing, and he understands that Jesus has next level authority, where he can command sickness the way a military officer commands his subordinates. He can just say the word, and the sickness will do what he says. Now, when Jesus hears that, how does he react in verse 9?
He's amazed
He was amazed, right?
What does he say?
that he has not found such great faith even in Israel.
And you notice he turns to the crowd when he says it, because he's talking to them, right? He's amazed because he appreciates the depth of this man's insight about who he is. We've seen lots of people being amazed at Jesus' power, but this centurion has an understanding that we haven't seen so far. And when Jesus addresses the crowd and says what he does, there's a little bit, I think, of a provoking comment right there to the people of Israel, who ought to be recognizing the authority that Jesus has because of all the things that they're seeing him do. And yet it's not the Israelites who are recognizing it, it's this Gentile. And then what happens in verse 10?
The men returned to the house and found the servant well.
Oh, what did Jesus say?
He just said he has great faith.
He didn't even say anything to heal him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the centurion said, you can say the word and heal him, and Jesus didn't even say the word. I mean, I guess he just thought it. I don't know. We know from the other gospel accounts that he actually says to the servants, just go home. He'll be well when you get there. But it's not like Jesus stands off at a distance and pulls out some, theological abracadabra. He doesn't pray. He's so powerful, he doesn't even have to say the word.
I have a question about the word marvel. Jesus marveled at that. Because every time we come to those things, I always, it's like, because Jesus is all-knowing, and I know there's that balance between his human nature, but he must surely have known. Is that a translation? I mean, is the word something else other than we, because Jesus,
I was thinking the same.
He can know it and he can understand it and still marvel over it. So, for example, let's say that, every evening when the sun goes down, you sit and look out your window at the sunset. You know every evening what's coming, right? You know what it's going to look like. But when the beauty of the colors hit, you marvel at it, don't you? Because you're seeing something amazing, you're like, wow. It's not because it shocks you or surprises you, it's because you're just responding to this thing that you're seeing. And I think that's what's happening with Jesus. I don't think he's surprised, I think he's just like, look at that.
And if you think he's around these people that are dull all
Yep.
the time,
Yeah. It's like having clouds over the sun for days on end and then suddenly seeing the sunset and being like, look. And I think he wants the people to know that he's like, what is it that impresses him? I mean, you know what I mean by that. What is it that gets his attention? It's not the smarts of the religious leaders. It's the insight of a Gentile centurion who nobody would expect to really understand who Jesus is, but he understands better than everybody else does. Okay, now right here, there's some Old Testament background that's worth thinking about. And that is the story of Naaman in 2 Kings chapter 5. So this is a story, it happens in the context of Elisha. This is the ministry of Elisha in 2 Kings. And there was this guy named Naaman who was a Gentile. He was a Syrian army commander, and he was actually an enemy of Israel. And he had this incurable skin disease. But he had this Israelite slave girl who he captured, who then told him there was this prophet in Israel who could heal him. So Naaman goes to see Elisha. And that whole encounter is very interesting. If I'd been Elisha, I'd been like, what are you doing here? But Elisha actually doesn't even go out to talk to him. He doesn't meet up with Naaman. he sends a messenger out to tell Naaman, go dip yourself 7 times in the Jordan River, and then you'll be clean. Naaman doesn't want to do it. His servants talk him into it. He goes out and dips himself in the river. And what do you know? He becomes clean. And then he comes back to Elisha. They have a conversation, and clearly Naaman becomes a believer. But he puts his faith in the God of Israel. Now, the parallels between that story and this one are very interesting. That you again have this army officer who's a Gentile, who's coming to the man of Israel to receive healing. And yet, what's interesting is the difference between how Elisha heals and how Jesus does it. That Elisha, of course, fully depends on the Lord to do this healing, and it's the Lord who heals him when he goes to the Jordan River and does the whole rigmarole. Jesus doesn't have to do any of that. Again, he can just think it, and it can be done. It's like you're getting a repeat of the miracle of Elisha for this Gentile, and yet Jesus' power and authority is in a category totally different from even the most powerful prophets of the Old Testament. And by the way, we got something about Elisha right here. We're going to get a parallel to Elijah in the bit that comes next. So, faith shows up in unusual places in the Gospel of Luke. Sometimes in places that people wouldn't expect, but this is what Simeon and Zechariah both told us to expect, that the Messiah would be a light for the Gentiles. And that's what you see happening right here. It's not just that Jesus can heal, it's that now the eyes of the Gentiles are being opened, and they're seeing the Jewish Messiah for what he is, which is more than just the Messiah for the Jews, but the Messiah for everybody. Okay, now what happens in verses 11 and 12?
There's a funeral,
Mm-hmm.
and he's the only son of his mother.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think it mentions that?
Because she didn't have any means of support after he was gone.
It's awful for her. This is a terrible situation. I mean, every funeral is a time for mourning, but this one even more so because she's a widow. And if her only son dies, that means she's got a future of destitution with no one to provide for her or to carry on her family line. So it's a very painful tragedy, and there's this large crowd of people from the town who are accompanying her as she's going out to bury the body of her son. And here's Jesus with his disciples in this large crowd. They're walking around, and they just suddenly run into this funeral procession. So what does Jesus do in 13?
He tells her not to cry.
Which would be kind of cruel if you weren't about to do what he does next. Now, did you notice that Luke calls Jesus the Lord right here? In my translation, I don't know what your translations say, my translation says when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. So you get something in your translation that indicates that he has compassion on this woman when he sees her. And I think it's significant that Luke calls him the Lord right here, because what you're seeing is the heart of God being wrung out by the tragedy of this woman. You're seeing God have compassion because he encounters this funeral procession and knows how painful it is for this woman who's lost her son. It reminds me of that prophecy we looked at in Isaiah 40 about how God himself will come with strength and power, and he will tend his people gently like a shepherd carrying his lambs close to his heart. Don't you see both of those things in these events? That here's Jesus who's got all the sovereign power and authority of the cosmos, and then he turns and speaks to this woman with just a kindness and tenderness because he has compassion on her. And then, when he says not to cry, he goes up to this funeral. It's a bier is actually what this is. It's not a coffin in the sense that it's not a pine box that's enclosed. It would have been like a wooden platform that they would have carried on their shoulders, and the body would have been on top of it. And so he walks up to that, and he stops the whole procession, which, by the way, is everything about this is unclean. Mm-hmm. Touching a dead body makes you unclean, right? Jesus didn't have to touch it. He could have stood off at a distance. But I think, again, what you're seeing is the permanent holiness of Jesus that just comes in person right up to this dead body. And what happens?
Tells him to get up.
Mm-hmm. And what happens?
He
Jesus.
And he does.
I love how Luke puts it, the dead man sat up.
And spoke.
Yeah, he starts to talk, and then you
Starts
think, what was he talking about? Was he like, wow, that was an amazing nap, or was I don't know. I don't know what you talk about when you wake up from the dead, but
Probably say, what am I doing here?
I'm back. That's right. Yeah, Jesus just commands him, and he wakes up out of death. The ritual impurity, it's not just that the ritual impurity gives way to Jesus. We've seen that happen before with the leper. It's that a dead body is permanently ritually unclean. There's no precedent in the Old Testament for somebody touching a dead body and not becoming unclean. The only way that could happen is for death itself to be reversed, which is exactly what Jesus does. It's not just that he cleans it, it's that he puts life back into him. That's what happens when death comes in contact with an indestructible life. So, well, before I go on, just let me read for you a comment that I read. Even though Jesus often heals in response to faith, that's not a requirement. So this is a bleak day for a woman in Nain, and Jesus just walks right into her sadness. He and those with him could have stood quietly on the side out of respect and let the procession go by. But unasked, he intervenes and he does something for this widow without any indication of faith on her part or on the part of anybody else. It's a marked contrast to what happened in verses 1 to 10 with the centurion. But this is often the case with us too. Doesn't our Lord frequently bring his help into our need unasked? If every benefit we receive depended on our faith or our prayers, how little would we have? It's so important that you see Jesus often responding to faith with healing. But faith is not a requirement. Jesus can heal anybody he wants. He can raise people from the dead if that's what he chooses to do. And so, it's not like anybody's standing there saying, oh, Jesus, come here, raise this guy from the dead. Nobody's looking for a resurrection. And Jesus just walks right into that and does what he wants to do. Okay, now it's worth noting the last part of verse 15, when it says, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. That's a nearly verbatim repetition of 1 Kings 17:23, which is where Elijah did the same thing for the widow of Zarephath. So in that story, if you remember, there's this widow who gives Elijah hospitality. Everybody's starving, but he goes and stays with her, and her oil and her flour never run out. And then at some point, her son dies, and she goes to Elijah with that, and he raises the boy from the dead. But do you remember how he did it? It's really a funny.
Didn't he lay on top of him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And breathe on him, put his hands here and his feet here, and I can't remember if that's the one where the boy sneezes 7 times. I don't know, but there's a whole, and he cries out to the Lord. In fact, I think he cries out to the Lord more than once. It's kind of complicated, that whole thing, but the Lord does it. The Lord raises that boy from the dead and gives him back to his mother. Now, the similarities are interesting, but it's the differences that are significant. Because Elijah had to go through all of that stuff, but how does Jesus do it? Mm-hmm. He's the God Elijah was praying to. Right? When Elijah's crying out to Yahweh to help him, Jesus is the God Elijah was crying out to. So he doesn't have to even pause. He can just tell the boy, get up. And he does, because of how much authority he has. He has more authority than Elisha. He has more authority than Elijah because he has authority over life and death to raise somebody with a word. Because he's the sovereign God. He's the creator. He's the author of life. Here's another aspect of the good news preached to the poor, of redemption that comes with the year of the Lord's favor from Isaiah 61, that Jesus releases his people even from the power of death. So it's not just that ritual impurity and unclean spirits and diseases give way before the holiness of Jesus. Death itself gives way too. So when the centurion recognized the authority that Jesus has, well, it just got ratcheted up right here. Because, again, healing from a distance is one thing, but raising from somebody from the dead, who can do that except the God of life? Now, how do the people react in 16 and 17?
They were filled with awe and praised God.
Mm-hmm. What'd they say?
A great prophet has appeared among us. God is coming to help his people.
What do you think about that response from the people right now?
They didn't recognize
They
him as
didn't,
Jesus, the Messiah.
They didn't. They're not wrong so much as it's just completely inadequate, right? I mean, to say a great prophet has come, they're missing the weight of who Jesus is. But it's understandable that they don't quite get it, because I think Jesus is in a category they don't have a category for who Jesus is and what he's doing. But he's so clearly not in the same category of all the great prophets who came before him. He's got so much more authority than that. And that second thing they say when it says God has come to help his people, what it literally says is that God has visited his people. And that word is important because it connects this back to the prophecy of Zechariah. So when Zechariah prophesied about the coming of the Messiah, he said that God would visit his people with redemption. Well, those words are now coming out of the mouths of the people when they say God has visited us. They know the power of God is at work right here. They just don't understand that it's Jesus himself who is God. And of course, news about Jesus spreads throughout Judea and the whole surrounding countryside. Okay, now, the scene changes. After that, those two miracles, now the scene's going to change in verse 18. So what happens in 18 to 20?
John's disciples,
John who?
not John the Baptist.
Yes,
Yeah.
John the
John.
Baptist.
Oh, this is John the Baptist?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm glad you told me that.
Yeah, so this is the disciples of John the Baptist. Okay, what
Okay.
do they do?
His disciples told them these things. Calling two of them, he sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?"
Okay, now, Luke is assuming that you remember some things from chapter 3. Where is John right now?
In the wilderness.
He's in prison. Oh, okay. And that's important for understanding what's going on right here. Why doesn't John just come himself? Because he can't. That's why he's sending messengers, because Herod has already put John in prison. And so while he's in prison, Jesus is out doing all these miracles, and John's disciples report back to him all these things that are happening. So interesting then, that after hearing all of that, all these things that Jesus has been doing, I mean, we just saw him raise somebody from the dead, that after all that, then John sends his disciples back to say, "Are you the one?" What do you think he means by that?
Are you the Messiah?
Are you the Messiah? Or should we be expecting somebody else? Are you or are you not? Is somebody else coming after you? Now, why would John ask something like that?
It seems strange because that was his cousin.
And he did have the job of being the forerunner, right? He proclaimed the message of God. He called the people to repentance. He prepared the way for the Lord. He was there when Jesus got baptized, right?
Maybe he's questioning his situation.
I think that's exactly,
Are you seeing what's happening to me?
yes, I think that's exactly what's happening. He's hearing all these reports, but he's in prison. And remember that job description that we got in chapter 4 when Jesus told us what his mission was going to be, that he would preach good news to the poor and he would release the captives and bring freedom for the prisoners. That is what he said he would do, and here's John still sitting in prison. And I think this is absolutely John's response to that, to say, okay, if you're the Messiah, why am I still here? Surely you're going to break me out. Surely you. Now here's the thing. Does Jesus have the power to do that? Of course he does. So it's not a matter of whether he's able to. It's a matter of whether he's willing to. Remember how the leper put it when he came to Jesus, when he said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean," and Jesus said, "I'm willing." Well, the same kind of thing is going on right here. Jesus is able to break John out of prison. He could snap his fingers and be done with it. The question is whether he's willing to do it.
I think as a praying parent, and we talked about this before, when you have one, if you still have, if that, what's the word, the conflict, that's not the word I want, but I know Jesus is it, but I don't know if he's willing, because not everyone's saved. So we have to leave it at his feet and
I find myself praying about things too where I think, this is clearly a good thing, Lord, and you're going to do it, so why don't you? Well, he's not going to explain himself to John, but he is able. He's just not going to. He's not going to break him out of prison. Now, let's look at his answer. It's very interesting. First of all, what's the situation for Jesus in verse 21?
He was performing miracles,
Specifically, doing what?
healing diseases
Mm-hmm.
and sicknesses and evil spirits and giving sight.
Yes. And the reason that Luke emphasizes all of that, I mean, he knows that we know that. We've just been reading it. But I think the reason Luke stops and emphasizes that in verse 21 isn't just because Jesus is doing miracles. It's because that catalog of miracles fulfills multiple prophecies of the Old Testament about the ministry of the Messiah. Prophecies that John himself would have known. So here's Luke saying, yeah, Jesus is doing all that stuff. And then what does Jesus himself say to the messengers?
Go tell John what I've been doing.
And that list that he mentions, when he says, the blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. He's alluding to the words of those prophecies in the Old Testament. Actually, all of those prophecies are found in the book of Isaiah. I know you're shocked by that, aren't you? It's all in Isaiah. There's so much in Isaiah about the coming of the Messiah and what he will do when he comes. Let me just read for you some examples. So, Isaiah 29:18 and 19. In that day the deaf will hear the words of the scroll, and out of gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind will see. Once more the humble will rejoice in the Lord, and the needy will rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. Isaiah 35:5 and 6. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. Isaiah 42:6 and 7. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. And then the bit we've already looked at from Isaiah 61:1 and 2. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of the vengeance of our God. It's like Jesus just says in miniature what all those prophecies from Isaiah predicted about the Messiah and what he would do. The year of the Lord's favor has arrived in the person of Jesus. But what's really interesting right here, remember back in chapter 4 when we looked at Isaiah 61 and we talked about how Jesus leaves off the bit about the vengeance, the day of vengeance of our God. He repeats a bunch of that prophecy, but leaves off the bit about vengeance because that's not what he's about just yet. Well, right here, when he lists off all these things that come from the prophecies of Isaiah, he not only leaves out the bit about vengeance, but I wonder if you notice he left out the bits about the captives being set free. Those prophecies from Isaiah, Jesus skipped that. He didn't have anything to say about the prisoners being released. Why would he skip that? Because John's not getting out of prison. It's not because, again, Jesus isn't powerful enough to free him. It's because that's not the work that the Father has given him to do. I can't even imagine how hard it must have been for John to hear that. And you know what's coming. I mean, what's the end for John? He's going to get executed by Herod. And Jesus could stop it, and he's not going to. But I think that's why Jesus says what he does in verse 23. What does he add?
Does anyone who does not stumble on account of me?
What do you think he means by that when he says that to John? He's got a choice to make now, right? If John's disappointed because Jesus doesn't meet his expectations, well, now what's next? He has a choice to make. Knowing the evidence from the prophecies that clearly demonstrate Jesus is the Messiah, he can either reject Jesus because Jesus isn't doing what he wants, or he can accept him along with the suffering of his own situation. even if he doesn't fully understand it. And, after all, the suffering of the messenger is a foreshadow of the suffering that's coming for the Messiah himself. I mean, John is the forerunner in more ways than one. They're going to treat Jesus even worse than they do John. So it's like Jesus gives John his own personal beatitude right here by telling him blessing will come if he's willing to persevere. If he's willing to put his trust in Jesus and hand himself over to the plan of God, even if he doesn't understand why this is how it's going to be. Let me read a quote for you from one of the commentators. The text carries a spillover for us. Don't be surprised if you have perplexities about Jesus. Often they will be the same in principle as John's were, which is, why isn't he working the way I thought he would? Why doesn't he meet my expectations? Why doesn't he do what the Messiah should do? Why is he taking so long to address this problem? Why doesn't he exercise more severity when there are matters that need to be put right? I'm sure you could add all kinds of your own questions to that too. Why doesn't he hurry up? Why doesn't he fix this problem? Why doesn't he save this person? I think Jesus would say the same to us that he says to John. You know who he is. Will you trust him? Will you trust him even if you don't understand why he's doing what he's doing? If he's unwilling to let John, to break John out of prison, break him out. That makes it sound like he's got to file out the...
Yeah.
No. I mean, Jesus can just think it, and it can be done, right?
Dynamite.
That's right. If he's unwilling to get John out of prison, does that mean that John's fate then is just one of destruction? I mean, he's going to get executed. Is that the end for John? No. Remember what we saw in the Beatitudes? The blessings and the woes in that sermon? There's something on the other side of the grave that's going to make it worth it. John doesn't understand everything that's coming, but when Jesus phrases this like one of those blessings from that sermon, there's a hint right here that whatever it is that John faces, and it's going to be execution by King Herod, he's not going to lose anything that ultimately matters. Everything that really matters is still going to be his because he's going to belong to God. What is he going to lose that he won't get back in spades? Because Jesus controls the other side of the grave. If Jesus can raise people from the dead, and we know he can because he just did it, then by definition there's no such thing as being too late. I mean, Jesus can leave John in prison until he dies and still not be too late because he's going to raise John from the dead just like he raises us. All right. Do you have comments? Anything you would like to add?
We're doing a study. I'm very talkative today, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Sherry's not here.
We like it.
Sherry's not here. She said Sherry's not here.
We're doing a study, and it's one that we can hardly wrap our mind around, and it's talking about Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, and the disciples going from fearful to being powerful, in being messengers. And one of the points made is that what they saw, they couldn't, in Jesus, is what empowered them. Because it was so beyond anything we can humanly conceive. And I think it struck me that this was that kind of moment for him to see him, that the message he got, because he knows only God would have that ability. But the list of the miracles, only God could do it. And it gave, supplied courage, apparently, to say, bring him. I'm not going to do it. And that was, that's when I'm trying to wrap my mind around all of it. Very thought-provoking.
I think Jesus understands the question that's under the question. And what I mean by that is, well, I think about that even for myself. I think there are times when I look around and I just think, Why is there so much suffering? Why does God allow so much suffering? Why is there all this pain and difficulty in the world? I mean, everybody thinks that at some point. And you know all of the arguments about, the fall and how sin corrupts creation and all that kind of thing. But I think at some point, I heard a podcaster say, when you ask those questions, why does God do that? Why are you asking? Because he said sometimes people ask that question because they're trying to think through the logic and the philosophy and they want an answer that's academically satisfying. But he said a lot of times people ask that question because what they really want to know is, how can I trust him? That's the question they're actually asking, is not, can you give me an academic reason for why there's pain and suffering in the world? What they're asking is, how can I trust you, Lord, if that's the reality we live in? If you say that you're good and you're merciful and you're kind and you're just, but I see all of these things around me. Well, how do you know you can trust him? Jesus, that's how you know. If Jesus was willing to suffer for us, if he was willing to die for us, he is a trustworthy God, even if I don't understand why the suffering is happening. And I think when Jesus hears this question, it's not, he already knows. The issue is not that John needs evidence that he's the Messiah. John's already got all the evidence. The issue is that John is struggling in the middle of suffering and doesn't understand why this is happening to him. And the challenge from Jesus is, you're going to have to trust me even though I don't do what you want me to. Because he knows the truth. And it's hard, but it's so relevant. Yeah. All right, anything else you want to add?